And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Let's get into more of these top international headlines now. Live Now look there in southern Israel, looking into the Gaza Strip on a very early Tuesday morning here. I want to put up this tweet here from President Biden because we're moving from Israel and Gaza now to the United Nations in New York City. Biden saying this today: the UN Security Council just adopted a resolution calling on Hamas to accept the deal to establish a ceasefire with the release of hostages. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This deal is an opportunity to prove they mean it. The UN also tweeting about the adoption of this today. This was a U.S.-sponsored resolution. That's important to note there. And you see there the photo of the Security Council saying that they have adopted a resolution calling for full and immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It also calls for the immediate, unconditional release of all hostages. Now, this comes as there have been a major shakeup in the Israeli war cabinet and the governing coalition that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has so relied on to be in power as Prime Minister. Fox News Foreign Affairs correspondent Trey Yingst has the pulse of the Israeli political dynamics there in Tel Aviv with this report.
A political shakeup rocking Israel overnight. Two war cabinet members, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, left Benjamin Netanyahu's emergency government, accusing the Israeli prime minister of putting his own political survival over the country's security needs.
Regrettably, Netanyahu is preventing us from advancing toward true victory, which is the justification for the ongoing and painful cost of war.
The decision is not expected to collapse the current Israeli coalition, but will put new pressure on Netanyahu by making him more reliant on far-right ministers in his government. These ministers are opposed to a U.S.-backed ceasefire proposal that would end the current war in Gaza and bring some of the remaining hostages home. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Israel today to discuss negotiations surrounding such an agreement. He says Israel is on board, but Hamas is not.
If you want a ceasefire, press Hamas to say yes.
After a daring Israeli operation over the weekend that rescued 4 hostages from central Gaza, Hamas released a statement in opposition to a deal that doesn't include a permanent ceasefire. New details are emerging about that raid. The Israeli military says the hostages were held in 2 civilian apartment buildings. According to a spokesman for the local hospital in Gaza, more than 300 were killed or wounded during the operation.
In a joint rescue operation with the Shin Bet, the Army, and a police commando team that was conducted under fire in the heart of Gaza, we were able to get 4 hostages back to their homes.
With no diplomatic solution emerging, Israel is expected to continue operating inside the Gaza Strip to search for the remaining 120 hostages. In Tel Aviv, Trey Yingst, Fox News.
Trey, thanks so much. So as you can see in Trey's report, there's a lot to get to tonight in the Israel-Hamas war. We're going to do that with our friend, national security analyst, a retired Marine intelligence officer, and co-host of the Strat podcast. He joins me. That's Hal Kempfer, of course. Hal, good to see you. Thanks for being with us. I know you've been traveling extensively here. But like I said, there is so much to get to. Let's start, though, at the United Nations. And this was a U.S.-sponsored resolution, and it passed. And so it's calling for the immediate release unconditionally of the hostages, but also an immediate ceasefire as well here. Is this a victory for the Biden administration and Biden administration folks at the United Nations to get this across the finish line, or is it purely symbolic, Hal?
Well, we hope it's not symbolic, but, you know, I think it's a victory if you can get the Security Council to UN to vote for anything anymore. Nothing seems to pass because you have the, of course, the 5 permanent members with veto authority. In this case, Russia actually abstained. They weren't, both Russia and China gave words of great skepticism that this was going to be implemented. They doubted that Bibi Netanyahu, amongst others, with his administration, were really in favor of this arrangement, despite the U.S. calling it essentially the Israeli proposal in so many words.
Right.
but it did. But it passed, and so I think that is a victory. It's not going to put in place, but it is a victory.
Sure, and the Associated Press describes that it passed, quote, overwhelmingly, with 14 of the 15 Security Council members voting in favor, like you said, Russia abstaining there. Is this of a piece with what President Biden announced now almost 2 weeks ago at the White House of this new deal, this new framework, these 3 phases, coming out there at the White House, I believe now almost 2 Fridays ago, saying Israel accepted this. Now everyone, the whole world is waiting on Hamas to accept this deal. Was this of a piece today there at the United Nations? Is this the same deal in the Security Council language and rhetoric and in the resolution that the Biden administration folks are urging Hamas to accept? It's one and the same, right? And so now you see these objectives playing out at the UN, right?
As far as I can tell, it's the same deal. In fact, it's pretty much the same deal that was floating around about a month or 2 ago. You remember when that whole thing collapsed over that one weekend, where it looked very promising going into the weekend, and by Monday, the whole thing collapsed, and Hamas agreed to a deal which was not this deal at all. This is the same thing that was proposed, and it's the 6-week program, 3 phases. The hope is that it leads to a permanent ceasefire. At least that's the way the White House hope, and amongst a number of others have hoped that it does. But it's not fixed in there. We'll say one thing that is rather challenging, though. Bibi Netanyahu has kind of couched his terms in ways that have raised questions as to whether he really is fully behind this.
Okay.
Hamas has not accepted it yet, and the problem they have for Hamas and Netanyahu both is if they accept this deal, both Hamas, Yahya Sinwar in particular, and Netanyahu face a serious prospect that signing on to this deal could end their rule, could end their time in office. And so that really is a rather interesting negotiating situation.
Okay.
But Hal, that all parties have to deal with.
Yeah, but Hal, also, doesn't it portend that the conflict would freeze in place even while Israel is conducting its Rafah operation? I mean, isn't that another concern too? And so that's what I wanted to ask as well. Has Israel really accepted this?
Well, the U.S. position is that Israel has accepted this. This is the deal that Netanyahu had agreed to previously. The only difference is, of course, now you have Netanyahu saying things that kind of raise a little bit of doubt as to whether he'll go through with it. But as you heard Antony Blinken saying today, and this has been all parties of administration have the same talking points, which is this is a deal, and they've said, look, Hamas, you got to put pressure on Hamas to accept the deal, and basically the U.S. is saying that Israel has accepted the deal, even though Israel, if you listen to Israel, you kind of wonder if they really have. But our position, or the U.S. position, is that Israel is part of this. Everybody else has agreed to it. It's only Hamas that is holding out, and that's kind of the story, the narrative, if you will, that's been going over and over again. And Antony Blinken today during his press conference at the airport pretty much made this clear. I think he said the same thing about 3 different ways, trying to push that point across.
Right. So from Hamas's standpoint, according to the Associated Press, when they initially viewed the proposal, they responded to it, quote unquote, positively. I don't know what that means, essentially moving forward. Also, Hamas responded to this adoption today at the Security Council by saying it welcomed the resolution and was ready to work with mediators in indirect negotiations with Israel to implement it. So maybe we're on the verge of something, some type of breakthrough. It's so easy to kind of get bamboozled here because everything could fall apart in a matter of seconds. So we just have to wait and see. How much, though, Hal, does the Israeli domestic political situation factor into all of this? I mean, that was a huge shakeup over the weekend. I want to put this tweet up if our viewers haven't heard by now. War Cabinet Minister and Biden administration ally Benny Gantz quits Netanyahu's government. That happened over the weekend, Hal. Benny Gantz had said as much. He delayed the announcement because of the awesome, miraculous news on Saturday of this daring hostage rescue, 4 Israeli hostages rescued in this raid. And so Gantz leaves after that. He had to postpone the press conference, Hal, to the day after. Mm-hmm. How much of a player was Gantz? What will his absence mean? He was in the war cabinet, Hal, but from what I've read and from who I've spoken with over there, it doesn't mean Bibi's coalition collapses, even though he's gone.
No, the coalition does not collapse. Actually, he was part of the war cabinet. This was basically a nonpartisan whole of government sort of thing. This is where different parts of the Knesset came together, and they formed what's called a war cabinet. And you had, moderate members who were definitely not part of Netanyahu's coalition or part of this. And Benny Gantz was, of the moderate members, was probably the most prominent because of his background. The military, former minister of defense, all the high offices he's held in the previous government. Of course, he was, they had that kind of sharing arrangement with the prime minister stuff. So he's held a lot of very senior level positions. So he had a lot of gravitas. But I think the problem he had is he kept raising it. And this is what he said. I mean, he said, I think his voice wasn't being heard as much. But what basically. The problem is he can't get Netanyahu to kind of articulate a day after sort of thing. What happens when the war stops? What happens when the fighting? What does that look like? And that was a frustration he had said on May 18th. That he gave that speech, which was very strong and kind of set the foundation for this.
Yeah, I mean, Hal, though, yes, Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu are arch political rivals. But at the end of the day, don't they have the same objectives when it comes to the prosecution of the war? Yet again, we're talking about the day after. What happens after the war is over? But there's an operation going on right now. Don't Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, aren't they on the same page when it comes to that?
I think they are to a certain extent. I think what you'd see with Benny Gantz is this, for example, this ceasefire agreement that's on the table. This is something he's very comfortable with. Netanyahu has made basically put out language that kind of makes everyone wonder if he is fully behind it. If Hamas accepts, would suddenly Netanyahu hedge? Of course, the concern that Netanyahu has is with his actual coalition, his actual cabinet. Of which the far right members, to include 2 ministers, have said that if he accepts the ceasefire, they'll walk. Now, Yair Lapid, another centrist member of the Knesset, has said that he will backstop Netanyahu's coalition to keep him in power for this, at least certainly for the duration of the ceasefire, as long as that goes. But of course, if you're Netanyahu and he's a political survivor and he works the check, if you will, he's looking at this saying, yeah, well, that's just a temporary fix. I probably won't be able to get the far right guys back. I'm definitely not going to be able to create a long-term solution with this. And of course, as we've talked about before, his big concern is if his coalition collapses, if he leaves office, he immediately marches over into a courtroom where he's got some very serious charges pending against him. And there's the distinct possibility that he could end up in prison. So he's got an incentive to stay in office. Yeah.
Hal, and obviously political survival is top of mind for any political leader, no matter if it's wartime or not. But it is wartime, and Benny Gantz is calling for elections in the fall. I mean, can nations like Israel prosecuting a war chew gum and walk at the same time and do both like this? I mean, could you even comprehend what if the coalition collapsed in the middle of the Rafah operation when there had not been the ceasefire proposal agreed to yet by Hamas? Wouldn't that just delay things further? Wouldn't it cause political chaos?
There is a certain amount of chaos that would be caused because it really, in terms of the IDF prosecuting the war, going forth with the orders that they have and taking the ground that they've been ordered to take, I don't see there being any great interruption. And certainly, they'd have a period of time where Netanyahu would remain in office until a new election is held. And so that would continue. until that new election takes place. So in that regard, things would continue to move. I don't see a big change. However, Hamas would see this as wind in their sails.
Okay.
And that probably would slow them down, or at least cause them to hesitate in accepting any sort of proposal agreement.
Okay, yeah, and you want to talk about wind in their sails. Was the daring hostage rescue over the weekend in central Gaza, I mean, was that a jolt in the arm to the Israeli body politic, to the citizenry there, you know, to soldiers and their families, for how this all goes on from here? I mean, did they need that? Did Israel need that over the weekend?
Oh, they really did. With everything going on, they really did. And I got to tell you, it's a huge jolt in the arm for the Israeli public. Of course, it's a big political win, if you will, for Netanyahu and his administration. The other thing, too, though, this is a tremendous embarrassment for Hamas. And as you've noticed, there's been some very different numbers come out as far as how many Palestinians were killed. The Israelis are saying less than 100. Hamas has basically said 274, and then there was some stuff out today where they said there could have been over 1,000 that were killed and injured. Just a widely different estimate. And part of this is, if you look at the embarrassment that Hamas felt, they're trying to spin some narrative to counter the fact that the Israelis successfully got in there, did this complex operation, got the hostages out. So it appears, from what I can see, that part of that narrative is to exaggerate and mischaracterize Palestinian losses in order to make it look like the Israelis did this, but they did it using, horrific, excessive force, and so that's the Hamas talking points, if you will. The truth is somewhere probably, I could say in between. I think it's a lot closer to what the IDF's saying, because they're going to have to be looked at very closely and scrutinized, whereas Hamas doesn't have to worry about that.
Right. Hal Kempfer, we got to leave it at that. We welcome you back, Hal. We appreciate all your insight into so many of these very heavy questions and topics on these conflicts around the globe. And we'll talk soon, Hal. Thanks.